Good day. As is traditional with this channel, I'm going to begin with a brief roundup of news from the battlefields. And in fact, there's been quite a lot over the last 24 hours, and it's coming from various parts of the battle lines. And in every single case, it seems as if the Russians are continuing to make further significant advances. Now, there's been reports of the Russians capturing more territory, more villages, and trying to capture more villages in the areas leading up to the town of Kupiansk, which was under Russian control until September, but which the Ukrainians took control of over the course of their Kharkiv counteroffensive, which of course began in early September. So the Russians seem to be edging steadily ever closer towards Kupiansk. There's some reports now that further south, on the borders with the Lugansk region, the Lugansk People's Republic, the Ukrainians have been fought to a standstill. Local Ukrainian commanders are said, this is from Russian sources, but it could be true, are said to be refusing Kiev's orders to launch offensives, and that the Ukrainian forces in that area, which is of course connected to the fighting in Kupiansk, further north in Kupiansk, that the Ukrainians there are now very much on the defensive. There's also some rather disturbing reports about a build-up of Ukrainian forces in Kharkiv region. Allegedly something like 20,000 men are being assembled. And there is some speculation, some chatter, especially on Russian channels, but I think also on some Ukrainian ones, that the plan is that in the event that there is a major Russian offensive after the new year, this force will not be used to plug any gaps in the offensive, but will try, caused by the offensive, but will try to destabilize the Russians, throw the Russians off balance by launching a counteroffensive into Belgorod region. This is, of course, a region not of Ukraine. It has never been part of Ukraine. It is part of the Russian Federation. It is part of the pre-1991 Russian Federation, or rather the 1991 to 2014 Russian Federation. And of course it would be an extremely sensitive issue for the Russians. So there is some talk of this, but for the moment in this area, northern Lugansk, Kharkiv, it is the Russians who are clearly on the offensive and who are gaining ground. I would add that, again, very much in contrast to the way the Russians acted back in September and October, when they were always careful to withdraw their troops rather than let them be encircled, and never made, stands to the last man, defending places which had become undefendable. The Ukrainians, by contrast, continue to defend every inch of territory. They seem to be fighting ferociously to try to hold on to Kupiansk, try to retain the gains that they made in the Kharkiv counteroffensive. They don't seem to show any sign of willingness to retreat or pull back, despite the very heavy losses in men and material that they seem to be suffering. Now, what exactly is the Russian objective in this offensive towards Kupiansk? Of course, nobody knows, but I've heard it suggested that it's not intended to recover all the ground lost over the course of the Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive. Its objective is to push Ukrainian forces west into the western bank of the Oskol River. In other words, to drive them off and to stabilize this part of the front on the Oskol River, which is a plan that many people thought, including myself, by the way, that the Russians had back during the fighting in September. In other words, to create and stabilize and then perhaps fortify the Oskol River line, whilst the main offensive takes place further south perhaps, in Donbass. Now that's a likely assumption, but let me repeat again, none of us knows exactly what Russian plans are, and anything that we say about this is speculative, but it would be consistent with the way in which the Russians have conducted operations up to this point. So that's one area of the fighting. Second area is Bakhmut, and there's been a lot going on there. I've now seen more maps. Again, they're not always easy for me to read, and I should say apologies. I'm not sure how to include maps in these programs. People sometimes ask me for this. I'm going to try and learn, and it's not just having it explained to me, given how technically, shall we say, inadequate I am. I will have to actually be taken through the process of how to embed maps in videos. But for the moment, the maps do appear to show Russian troops pressing now very deep into Bakhmut. There's clearly fighting going on right in the deep inside the residential districts of Bakhmut, which indicates the very heavy intensity of the fighting in a town supposedly of around 75,000 people before the war. In other words, by no means a very big place. And yesterday, I discussed the fact that Zelensky himself had visited Bakhmut. Now, this provoked lots of comments and speculations on both sides of the battle and in the various medias, the Western, the Russian, wherever, about Zelensky's trip to Bakhmut. There were some rather sneering commentaries about his trip in the Russian media, some of which cast doubt on whether he actually visited Bakhmut at all. My own view is that he most certainly did, but that he didn't go into the really heavily contested areas in the center. The suggestions are that he went into a shelter, into some sort of a shelter on the western outskirts of Bakhmut. In other words, some distance from the front lines, but not, it should be said, an area which could be considered completely secure. And he was only there apparently for a short time, and then he went straight back to Kiev, which seems to me, by the way, a sensible thing to do. Now, I'm going to come to why Zelensky went to Bakhmut in a moment, but yesterday I discussed that it was an ominous sign. It confirmed that the Ukrainians seem to be determined to cling on to Bakhmut come what may, that they're going to make a massive fight of defending the place, that they're building trenches. There's now information that they're converting some of the residential buildings into sort of fortresses. There's a picture floating around of a Ukrainian tank in the center of Bakhmut being deployed there as part of the defense systems that are being created. So it looks as if this battle for Bakhmut is going to continue despite the massive loss that Ukraine is suffering every day trying to cling on to this place, and despite the fact that the Russians, with the Wagner organization assault troops at the vanguard, continue to roll up settlements around Bakhmut and are pushing now apparently towards a settlement called Ivanivka, which, if they do eventually capture, will mean that any Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut itself would not only be cut off from resupply, but would be unable to retreat. So it's looking increasingly as if Bakhmut is indeed becoming a kind of Ukraine Stalingrad, a rather ominous development, and one which, as I said, I'm going to discuss in more detail shortly when I discuss what seem to be the rationalizations, the reasons behind this, in my opinion, extraordinary and deeply inhumane decision. But that's my own take. Let's discuss further the sort of things that might be happening and the reasons why the Ukrainians might be taking these sorts of steps. Anyway, In the meantime, alongside the heavy fighting in Bakhmut, which, as I said, continues. By the way, I should say that Yevgeny Prigozhin, the erstwhile founder of the Wagner Group and the man who's certainly coming forward as its key spokesman and physical embodiment, he's also been in Bakhmut. Apparently, when he learnt that Zelensky was there, he rushed to the Russian controlled areas in and around Bakhmut, and there's actually quite a lot of pictures of him, and he issued a somewhat sarcastic or ironic, if you prefer, requests to Zelensky that the two of them might want to meet somewhere in the center of Bakhmut. Well, anyway, we'll put all that aside, but that was some of the things that Prigozhin said. But anyway, intense fighting for Bakhmut, and there's also more reports of more fighting going on further south, more reports of shelling of Donetsk city, and of the Russians continuing their drive in Marinka and in the areas around. The Ukrainians have been launching more counterattacks in this area, but the Russians claim that they've repelled all of these counterattacks, that they're consolidating the ground that they have captured, and one gets the sense again that the ultimate Russian target is from Marinka, it is Vuhledar. And once they've finished with Vuhledar and broken the resistance of the Ukrainians in that area, that they will be able to move and finish off the remaining Ukrainian forces in Avdiivka. And I've seen it suggested now that the fall of Bakhmut will eventually lead to the collapse of Ukrainian defenses in northern Donetsk region, which includes the big towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and the fall of Marinka, Avdiivka, and Vuhledar will eventually lead to the collapse of Ukrainian resistance in southern Donetsk region. And I'm going to discuss in a moment the discussions, the conversations which took place between Pushilin, who is the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, and Putin on this very question. Anyway, so that's the situation on the battlefields. There is more information about the general state of things in Ukraine itself. It's now very clear that the Russian missile and drone strikes of the previous week have been devastating. There was a report at one point, as I remember, which said that electric power had been fully restored in Kiev. That was admittedly between the missile strike and the drone strike. Well, if that actually happened, it didn't last very long, because it's clear that much of Kiev still lacks electric power, and there are power shortages and outages right across Ukraine at the moment, and the situation seems to be deteriorating, with the Ukrainian energy company Ukrenergo saying that it's finding it increasingly difficult to restore power, and that it cannot give a date for when power will be fully restored, even in Kiev. So, very bad situation there, and one that is causing a great deal of hardship to the Ukrainian people. So, that's the overall military situation in Ukraine at the moment. Now, there is an awful lot else going on, and I'm going to start with one topic which has not attracted anything like the attention that it perhaps deserves, but which I find deeply ominous. We've seen the meetings between Putin and a very strong Russian delegation and Lukashenko and the Belarusian authorities in Minsk. What hasn't been reported to anything like the extent that it should be is reports of a mobilization that is apparently underway in Poland. This is not a mobilization that it seems has been formally announced. But it's clear that reservists are now being called up. There was information that a prominent Polish rock singer has also now been called up and will presumably have to join the Polish military. And the reports suggest or claim that something like 300,000 troops that the Polish army is trying to build up a force of something like 300,000 troops. Now, to my knowledge, this has been barely reported in the Western media. I wasn't sure that it was happening, but this apparent call-up of this Polish rock musician seems to me to put the matter beyond doubt. It does now seem as if some kind of mobilization in Poland is underway. And the question is, to what purpose? Is it because the Polish leadership worry that there might be a Russian incursion into Poland, that once the Russian offensive has taken place and the Ukrainian military collapse, that will bring the Russians to the Polish border, and that this is something that alarms them, that perhaps they're also alarmed by the Russian build-up in Belarus? Maybe it's a defensive move. But there has to also be concerns that it might not be, that it might be an offensive move. And there are also other reports which suggest that the Polish leadership is now thinking very hard about sending some kind of occupation force, or maybe we won't call it an occupation force, a force into Western Ukraine, with some suggesting that the timeline is for sometime in May, in order, well, who knows for what purpose, to defend Western Ukraine from any further Russian advances, on the assumption that the Russians have captured most of eastern and central Ukraine by then, or possibly, as some have suggested, in order essentially to reconquer territories of Western Ukraine, like the city of Lviv, or Lvov if you prefer, which before the Second World War were part of Polish territory. I don't know what the intention is. All I know is that this mobilization is taking place. This is a mobilization by a NATO member state. I presume the NATO authorities are aware of it. The fact that they're saying nothing about it, I also have to say, I find extremely ominous. And one way or the other, the fact that one country in NATO is mobilizing ought to cause everybody concern, if only because it suggests that some kind of clash between a NATO state and the Russians is now, if not on the cards, at least becoming a very serious possibility. Now, that's all I'm going to say about this topic. I just want to highlight its importance. If anybody has anything to add to it, if any viewers from Poland want to comment about it, well, they're all very welcome to do so, and to let me know what they think and what opinions about it they might have. So that's what I wanted to say about this. Now, we are seeing both sides, both the Ukrainians and the Russians, taking major political steps. And I'm going to first start with the Ukrainians. Now, it's become very clear to me that Zelensky's trip to Bakhmut is part of a carefully orchestrated and prepared lobbying campaign, which has been underway for some time, and which the culminating point of which is, of course, Zelensky's visit to the United States. And that is underway today. He's apparently only going to be in the United States for a few hours, but he's apparently going to attend a joint session of Congress, and he's going to meet with Biden in the White House. Now, this is his first announced foreign trip since the conflict began. There have been lots of rumors that he has actually made private, or shall we say secret, trips from Ukraine. at other points in the conflict. I saw a very interesting report, for example, from John Helmer some months ago, which suggested that a meeting between Zelensky and top Polish leaders and officials most probably took place in Poland rather than Kiev, as was being claimed at the time. I don't know about that, but anyway, there was that report. Maybe Zelensky has travelled outside Ukraine before, but if he's done that, it has been a private, secret way of doing so. This is, if you like, a public visit, public trip. And the rumours are, I'm making this programme as there's been reports that he took a train, presumably, through Poland to Germany and boarded an American business jet, defense owned by the US Department of Defense, and that it is this jet which is flying him to Washington, where he's due to meet the US leaders. Now, all of this, it seems to me, is, as I said, part of a lobbying campaign, and we've been seeing the evidence of this for some time. There was those interesting op-eds by Boris Johnson, for example, saying that Ukraine should be given every weapon that it needs. We've been seeing other reports like the one in The Economist with the Ukrainian generals giving a shopping list of the sorts of weapons they wanted: 300 tanks, 700 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 howitzers, all that sort of thing. We've seen other attempts to sort of prepare us for the need for more support for Ukraine. We've had a whole string of articles in the New York Times, for example, talking up Ukrainian victories or alleged victories earlier in the war. Very strange reporting, by the way, which, as was pointed out by Robert Barnes in a live stream that we did yesterday on the Duran, actually contradicts some of the New York Times' own on-the-spot reporting at this time. And, of course, we now have Zelensky's trip to Bakhmut, and I'm going to suggest that one of the reasons why the Ukrainians are clinging on to Bakhmut so tenaciously, why Zelensky went there, surely in part to make sure that there was no unauthorized retreat from Bakhmut, despite the apparent urgent demands from some Ukrainian soldiers and commanders that this town be finally abandoned, is because he didn't want to go to Washington with a defeat in Bakhmut either having already happened or in the process of happening. He wants to give the impression of a Ukraine that is still fighting, that's still able to keep on the battle. So why is he going to Washington? Well, Reuters has said that he's coming with a demand for weapons, and more weapons. And that, of course, is true. But he would not be going to Washington unless this had been coordinated with his allies in the administration, who of course include the president himself, President Biden, who, in my opinion, despite all of the suggestions to the contrary, remains deeply committed to this Ukraine adventure, if you like, this conflict in Ukraine. And I think the reason is not difficult to work out. By Friday, the US Congress has to pass a $1.7 trillion budget spending bill, omnibus bill, to cover spending for the entirety of 2023. This is something that the Biden administration has cobbled together with the establishment Republican leadership, Mitch McConnell and people like that, in order to try to preempt any moves by the new Congress, which convenes on the 3rd of January, and in which the Republicans have a majority in the House of Representatives, to rein back spending. And it's clear that part of the spending that some Republicans want to pull back on alongside many other things, is spending for Ukraine. Apparently, this omnibus budget has tucked away in it a spending package for Ukraine amounting to $44 billion. And that's basically why Zelensky is coming. He wants to come, the administration, in other words, has brought him to Washington, brought him on a public trip, something he's never done before, in order to get him, in effect, to be a public voice in Washington, demanding more support from the United States to mobilize opinion in Congress and to some extent in the country, though one suspects that for some people that's less important, in order to get this omnibus spending package through the Congress with this component, which is spending for Ukraine. And the leader, the Republican leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, has actually come out and said that for a majority of Republicans, not clear what he means by that. Does he mean the Republican base, or does he mean the Republicans in Congress and the Senate and the House? Who knows? But he says that for the majority of Republicans, continued support for US support for Ukraine is a priority. In other words, it's a message from the Republican establishment, the anti-Trump establishment, if you like, that despite growing criticism of the spending on behalf of Ukraine from people like, well, Donald Trump himself, but others as well, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Josh Hawley, all of those sort of people, that despite that, Republicans are expected to give bipartisan support to this spending bill and its important component, which is spending this $44 billion package for Ukraine. And we also hear that there's going to be a $2 billion announcement of aid for Ukraine, and the high point of this is the Patriot missile, air defense missile delivery, which I suspect will account for by far the bulk of the cost of this delivery. Now, on the topic of the Patriot missile delivery, there is actually something I wanted to just briefly say as an aside. There's been a very interesting article in The Guardian, of all places, and it concedes that this missile system, even though it claims that it is very advanced, is not going to be sufficient to solve Ukraine's air defense needs. But this article said that the reason the administration up to this point has been unwilling to supply Ukraine with Patriot missiles is not because of any concern of Russian escalation in response, but because there is a general shortage of Patriot missiles. And this shortage not only affects the number of Patriot missile systems in the Gulf, used by countries like Saudi Arabia, but it also affects US forces in the Pacific which are countering China, and that there is concerns that if Ukraine burns through Patriot missiles at the same rate that it is burning through all sorts of other weapons, and this article, for the first time, admitted that Ukraine has been utterly prodigal in its use of HIMARS missiles. It's used them in far higher volumes than the Americans think is appropriate. If Ukraine does that with its Patriot system, it is going to deplete the stock of Patriot missile systems, which is becoming very short, to an even greater degree, and that is going to weaken even further the US posture towards China, because it means that missiles which were being earmarked to counter Chinese threats are going to have to be diverted to Ukraine. So there's an interesting article, and can I just say, in parenthesis, that it completely corroborates every point about the Patriot system that has been made by Brian Paletic on the new Atlas. He was the first person, to my knowledge, to point out that there is a worldwide shortage of Patriot missiles. And here we have a mainstream media outlet, The Guardian, actually confirming this. So that's an interesting development in itself. But anyway, nonetheless, despite all of those concerns, it looks as if Zelensky is going to get his Patriot system, even though it's unlikely to make any difference on the battlefields, and in fact is going to create more problems for the US's overall military position. So that's what's going on the one side. What about the other? Well, I've been discussing a series of meetings that Putin has been having with all sorts of people. That on Thursday of last week, he met with his Security Council. On Friday, he met with Surovikin and the staff, the Stavka, if you like, that is now in overall charge of the war in Ukraine. And by the way, the Kremlin has quietly confirmed that this meeting did not take place in Moscow, as I assumed, but actually took place in the conflict zone. Didn't tell us where, but no doubt Ukraine knows where Surovikin's headquarters is. Presumably is well behind the front lines in a place which Ukrainian missiles can't reach, for the moment at least. But anyway, that's where Putin apparently went. Then he visited Minsk and had this very important meeting with Lukashenko, which I've discussed extensively. Then yesterday, he had meetings with the heads of the two republics, the former Ukrainian regions, the republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, former Ukrainian regions, which, as far as the Russians are concerned, are now part of Russia. And it's clear that both meetings had a civilian and military component. Now, the civilian part was all about reconstruction, especially heavy emphasis on the health, rebuilding the health systems, rebuilding houses, a lot of talk about the reconstruction of Mariupol, for instance. But it's clear that there was also some discussion of military aspects. Now, I say that because whilst Putin's meeting with the leader of Lugansk, the Kremlin readout is only about civilian matters. The readout with the Kremlin readout of the meeting with Pushilin, the leader of the Donetsk Republic, that at the very tail end says some things about the fact that the Ukrainians continue to shell Donetsk city. Pushilin asks for better air defense systems and more counter-battery artillery systems. And there's then a discussion about the fact that the Western media and human rights agencies have completely ignored the shelling of Donetsk, and it's as if the people of Donetsk don't exist. And then there's a brief discussion about Merkel's revelations that Ukraine was never serious about implementing the Minsk Accord, and so it seems neither was the West, beyond a certain point at least. But then it's clear that there's a large further part of the discussion which concerns military issues, which we are not informed about. And, well, who knows what the two said to each other, but again, I can't help but think that Putin is using this meeting to some extent to brief the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics on what the Russian plans are, and then perhaps also solicit their views and perhaps coordinate with them on various matters concerning the war. And that is going to be overshadowed with the meeting, which is ongoing as I'm making this video, of the Collegium of the Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense in Moscow. And it's called the Collegium. It used to be called the Collegium in Tsarist and Soviet times, but apparently at some point somebody adopted Western terminology. It's now called the board, a board meeting, which I find actually a bit strange. I prefer Collegium, but there we are. That's what it's called today. But this, it turns out, is an enormous meeting. Apparently 15,000 officials are participating in some way. I wonder how that's done. I wonder how they're all brought in and how they're all involved. Anyway, there's an overview. There's been an overview from Putin about overall military developments. There's been, in which he appears to have focused on the strategic forces. And there's also a report being delivered from the Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. Now, I'm not going to discuss this meeting at the moment in this video because for the moment, well, the Kremlin has not provided detailed readouts and the meeting is still ongoing. So that will have to be something I'm going to touch on in my next video, hopefully tomorrow. So, but nonetheless, this meeting is going on and it seems to be huge and it's clearly a very important meeting indeed. But something else is also taking place simultaneously, and this is perhaps conceivably the most important meeting of all, perhaps even more important than Zelensky's meetings in Washington and Putin's trip to Minsk and his meeting with Lukashenko, because another very important Russian official, Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, an outspoken hawk on the war in Ukraine, somebody who also seems to have some kind of supervisory role over the Russian war economy. He seems to visit factories and get reports from people about arms production and all that sort of thing. Well, he has visited Beijing and he's had a meeting there, a one-to-one meeting with no less a person than Xi Jinping. And note that this is taking place simultaneously with Russian-Chinese naval exercises. Now, I have to say, first of all, this is unusual. It's unusual for Xi Jinping to have a one-to-one meeting with an official who is not the head of state or leader of another country. It's a protocol point, but usually, given that Medvedev is not the leader of Russia, you would expect him to meet with an official of analogous rank to himself in the Chinese political hierarchy. But this time, he's had a one-to-one meeting with Xi Jinping. The Chinese have released a film in which you see the two meet and shake hands, and Xi Jinping seems pleased to see Medvedev. We're told that Medvedev brought with him a letter of some kind from Putin for Xi Jinping. Of course, Xi Jinping will already know what's in the letter because it will have been sent to him in advance. I mean, it's inconceivable that by this point Xi Jinping isn't already familiar with this letter. And no doubt we will eventually be getting a readout of this meeting as well. The Russians have provided us with some information, but again, before I discuss this meeting, I'm going to wait for the Chinese readout, and Chinese readouts, as we know, tend to be very extensive and very detailed. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this meeting is that it comes directly after a telephone conversation between the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and the Chinese President Xi Jinping. It's almost as if Olaf Scholz telephoned Xi Jinping in advance of Medvedev's meeting, of Xi Jinping's meeting with Medvedev. Perhaps somehow or other he got wind that this meeting between Xi Jinping and Medvedev was about to take place. Now, the Germans say that Olaf Scholz told Xi Jinping to try to put pressure on the Russians to achieve a peaceful settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, and thanked Xi Jinping for restraining the Russians from using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. The last, by the way, I don't actually believe, because, of course, had Scholz said something like that to Xi Jinping would undoubtedly have responded that, so far as the Chinese are aware, the Russians have made no threats to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Most probably, Xi Jinping simply said that China opposes any use of nuclear weapons, which is a well understood policy. Scholz probably had said previously that Germany opposed the use of nuclear weapons, and then, having taken that comment away, Scholz then and his team then spins it to make it look as if the Chinese are somehow putting some kind of pressure on the Russians. Well, as I say, we don't have much information about this meeting between Medvedev and Xi Jinping, but from what we can see, it looks as if Xi Jinping has, on the contrary, said that Chinese-Russian relations need to be taken further and developed to an even higher level. Anyway, what did Medvedev and Xi Jinping discuss? Well, I am sure that they discussed the conflict in Ukraine. I wonder whether Xi Jinping received Medvedev one-to-one, because the original plan had been for Putin to go, and that Putin has had to put off a trip to China because he's having all these other meetings in Moscow with the Defense Ministry Board and all of the rest. He's having a very tight schedule, and for that reason he had to send Medvedev instead, with Xi Jinping agreeing to meet him. But it does look as if the Chinese and the Russians are coordinating further, and one wonders what the nature of that coordination is going to be. I'm again not going to speculate further until I see the Chinese readout. So all of that going on, lots going on both the military front and the diplomatic front. There's some further news on the economic position. Bloomberg has issued a report that says that over the course of December, Russian oil exports halved, which I think is almost certainly true, though I expect that they will rebound over the next few weeks. And of course, the point is that the reason that these exports have halved is because the European Union's sanctions against Russian oil imports has now kicked in, and of course the Russians are still in the process of redirecting much of their oil flow eastwards to their friends China, India, Turkey, and the rest. So it's unsurprising. It's something that happened briefly, as I remember, in the spring and early summer, when again there was a general freeze in Russian oil exports, something which, by the way, caused oil prices to skyrocket, and it's a sign of adjustments, the market adjusting to these sanctions policies. In the meantime, the Russians have responded in the way that they always do when there are disruptions in supply of oil and when there are falls in the oil price, which is that they have been in the process of carrying out what looks to me to be a carefully controlled devaluation of the ruble. The idea is that the less oil costs in dollars, the more you want to lower the ruble so that you get the same amount of rubles per barrel of oil that you spend as you did when the ruble was higher against the dollar. And that, of course, protects your budget, and it's what the Russians have done in the past, as I said, when the oil price has fallen or when their oil supply has been disrupted, and they seem to be in the process of doing that again. The reason I think that this is a controlled devaluation, by the way, is that interestingly, it's not just a devaluation against the dollar and the euro, but it's also a devaluation against the Chinese currency, the RMB, and that has not historically happened when the Russians have undertaken devaluations before, but it is a sign of the growing importance of trade in RMB for the Russians, that the RMB is now becoming the key currency in Russia's trade, and so they want to make sure that they receive as much in rubles as they did before, despite the falling oil price from their trade with China. I would say that Chinese importers are still continuing to buy oil from Russia at well above the EU's price cap. So that's where we are on the energy front. As happened in the spring, I expect this problem to sort itself out once the market adjusts to these situations as it did before. And I would point out as well that, of course, the whole point of the oil price cap was that there should be no decline in Russian exports. Janet Yellen was worried that if Russian exports of oil overall declined, that would cause a rise in the oil price, and we've seen that in fact the result of these EU-US sanctions has been at least a temporary fall in Russian oil exports, which will presumably over the course of time lead to a rise in the oil price. The EU is now intent on making this problem even worse by imposing a cap on price of Russian gas. That has to be LNG now, because to say it straightforwardly, there isn't any other gas in any great volumes flowing to the EU from Russia, at least not for the time being. But nonetheless, that's what they're trying to do. Again, they're trying to calibrate it by announcing a cap which is actually higher than the actual price of gas at the moment. Again, as has been admitted in the business media, all that's going to do is it's going to create more gas shortages in Europe and complicate Europe's energy problems. So that's all I'm going to discuss in this program. This has been another longish program that I've done, but I hope that it gives you a clear overview of where we are. Much more to discuss. We have, as I said, Zelensky's visit to Washington, when we'll get some idea of what the Americans are going to do and whether Zelensky's lobbying effort, or rather the addition of Zelensky to the current lobbying effort, is going to be enough to get this omnibus bill with its $44 billion fund for Ukraine passed by Friday. I predict yes, by the way. I think it will be passed. And also whether, and also what is going to come of these various meetings that the Russians are having, the Ministry of Defense board meeting in Moscow, this huge meeting that is currently underway, and also Medvedev's trip to Beijing once we get the Chinese readout. I would say that, in my opinion, the single most important news over the last couple of days, something that's flown under the radar, but which may prove to be of great and ominous importance, is this Polish build-up, this Polish mobilization, and it is something which I think ought to fill everyone with great concern. Anyway, that's me for the day. There'll be more from me soon. And of course, I look forward to you joining me again in future programs. And remember, you can find all our programs on our various platforms. Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Rockfin, and Telegram. And you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to take the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.